So is Hegel saying then that total reality is something mental or spiritual, or this word Geist may be poised between the mental and the spiritual, and that all the processes that we're talking about are processes ultimately of this ultimate mental or spiritual thing?
Yes, that's the ultimate view that Hegel comes down to, that reality is Geist, it's ultimately mental or intellectual, and these processes happen to Geist, to mind, as it develops along the way.
Now, to some people listening to the discussion, this might already begin to sound like a very bizarre idea. So I think it's worth pointing out that, in fact, we're all very familiar with something similar to this in the case of religious beliefs, even if we ourselves are not religious people. I mean, many religious believers, including many Christians, believe that all of reality is ultimately spiritual, and that all of reality ultimately has a spiritual or significance or meaning. And I suppose Hegel is saying something very closely related to that, is he? Though not necessarily religious in the conventional sense.
Yes, but the difference might be that the Orthodox Christian view, I think, holds that God is spiritual but separate from the world, and the world is mundane and material, although it has a spiritual significance, certainly, but it's separate from it. But for Hegel, there's a closer union between the two. You could present the opposite of the Christian view by saying that Hegel is a pantheist, that he believes that God is in the world and in everything. That's perhaps not quite true either, but it's somewhere between the traditional Christian conception and the pantheistic one, that reality is part of God, everything is a manifestation of God, if you want to call it that.
In fact, I mean, it would be true to say that ever since Hegel, there has been a dispute between Hegel scholars or philosophers about precisely this question relating to Hegel's philosophy. Is Hegel's philosophy ultimately religious or not? There are some who've said that it is, there are some who've maintained that it isn't. Which side of that debate do you come down on?
I think that it is immensely valuable to try and interpret Hegel as if he were not religious, because then you find that you can make good sense of a large part of Hegel's philosophy in a non-religious way, just interpreting him as talking about mind, and the common element in mind being our common ability to reason, the fact that our minds are structured in similar principles. But I think I have to admit that though you can push that a long way, you don't really make 100% sense of Hegel in that way. The last 10% perhaps has to assume that there is some religious or quasi-religious view of mind or spirit that lies behind what he's saying.
Now, we've talked about the view of reality as a historical process, which he introduced into Western thought. It's a major idea. And we've talked about this notion of dialectical change, which he introduced and which is a living idea to this day. Another important concept, which I think I'm right in saying he coined, certainly he made it famous, and which has come back again into what one might call intellectual fashion in recent decades, is the concept of alienation. Hegel had a great deal to say about alienation, didn't he? Now, what exactly did he mean by that term?
By alienation, Hegel meant the idea that something which is in fact us or part of us seems to us foreign, alien, and hostile. Let me give you an example. He presents a picture of what he calls the unhappy soul, which is an alienated form of religion. The unhappy soul is the person who prays to a God whom he regards as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, and who sees himself by contrast as powerless, ignorant, and base. So this person is unhappy because he demeans himself and puts all those qualities into some being which he sees as separate from himself. Hegel says that this is wrong. We are, in fact, part of God, or if you like, we are projecting our qualities into God, and we should take that back. The way to overcome that kind of alienation would be to realize that we and God are one, and that we have those qualities. They are not something separate and foreign to us.
I was going to say, he would say specifically that these are human, and perhaps only human qualities, which we are projecting onto an all-powerful being, denying them to ourselves, when it is in fact we who have them. I mean, they originate with humanity.
The claim that they are only human was actually made by one of his later disciples, Ludwig Feuerbach, he wouldn't have said that, but he would have said that we and that kind of divine spirit are all part of the same reality, Geist or mind.
Now, you've explained very clearly, I think, how Hegel saw total reality as being a process of change which was moving forward in a certain way, the dialectical movement. What is it going towards? What is the goal? What's the end of this movement?
The end point of the dialectical process is mind coming to know itself as the ultimate reality, and thus as seeing everything that it took to be foreign and hostile to itself as in fact part of itself. And that for Hegel is simultaneously a state of absolute knowledge, when mind knows, recognizes at last itself as the ultimate reality, and also a state of absolute freedom, when mind, instead of being controlled by external forces, is able to order the world in a rational way, because now it sees that the world is in fact itself, and it only has to implement its own principle of rationality onto the world to organize the world rationally. Now, the interesting thing about this culminating process is that because it occurs once mind understands that it is the reality of everything, if you ask the question, when does this actually happen? Well, it happens when Hegel's own mind in his philosophical writings and thoughts, grasps the idea that mind is everything. And then he's achieved this. It's not just that Hegel describes the goal, the culmination of all this process, but Hegel's philosophy actually is the very culmination of the whole process he's describing.
So when Hegel published his main works, that was total reality at last, achieving awareness of itself, achieving self-knowledge.
Yes.
It's an amazing piece of sort of grandiose self-projection on the part of a philosopher. I'm not sure quite that Hegel realized that it could be seen in this light. Now, one thing that strikes one about the aim towards which all this is moving, in the way you just put it, is that it's sometimes seen as freedom, sometimes seen as self-knowledge. And Hegel clearly did think that those were, in some sense, the same thing. And I think a little more needs to be said about that, because it's not at all clear, I think, to most people how self-knowledge can itself constitute freedom.
Well, self-knowledge becomes freedom because of the particular nature of mind and of Hegel's idea that mind is the ultimate reality of the world. You see, in the historical process up to the point at which we recognize that, if you like, it's our world, that we are all, up to that point, we have really been pawns in the game. We haven't been controlling the game. We haven't been controlling the historical stage, because things have been happening to us without us realizing or understanding why they happen, because what we take to be foreign and hostile aspects of the world are in fact part of us. But once we come to see that we are everything in the world, then we understand the process. We've grasped, if you like, the laws of historical development, and we see that those laws are in fact our own reason. They are the very laws of our mind and our thinking.
Was this behind the famous quotation that's often made from Hegel, the real is the rational and the rational is the real? That what exists does correspond to
what is rational. That's
yes,
right.
Yes.
And when we come to see that, then we are free, because we see the rationality of reality, and it no longer strikes us as something contrary to our interests. We no longer struggle against it. We understand it as, in fact, our own rational principle, and we are free to flow along with it, and indeed to order it and direct it in accordance with those laws of reason.